Dr. Ehrman?
Yeah, I should let you all know that we had dinner together tonight and Mike was having trouble. And I did volunteer to state his case for him.
Okay, we'll go to the next question. Dr. Ehrman, how do you explain the disciples and Paul's willingness to suffer and die for Jesus' bodily resurrection if they had the merely ghostly experiences referred to in your rebuttal?
Yeah, excellent question. Another thing I get asked a lot is a similar question. The way it's usually phrased is, why would all of the disciples willingly be martyred if they didn't know that Jesus was raised from the dead? If they just, made it up or something, would they really be willing to go to their deaths? And there's several things I want to respond to with respect to that. First of all, this may come as news to you, but the reality is we don't know how most of the disciples of Jesus died. We don't have evidence. We have legends from hundreds of years later, but the idea that all of the 11 disciples were martyred for their faith is simply a legend. We don't know how they died. Now the question is asking, would people like Paul be willing to die for a mere apparition as opposed to the real resurrection? My view is not that Paul thought he had a mere apparition. My view is that Paul had an apparition that he interpreted as Jesus being physically present to him. Just as people today have an apparition of their lost husband, their lost child, their lost grandmother, and they think that the person's actually in the room. And the person is tangible, can be touched, can be smelled. And so Paul interpreted this vision as Jesus actually being raised from the dead, and I think Paul probably was killed for his faith. And probably Peter, we have evidence from the first century for those two, but for no one else.
Any response?
Yeah, I agree, except I would add James to that equation in addition to Paul and Peter. We do have about 8 different sources, relatively early sources, some dating from 30 to 200 years after Jesus, that the disciples were all willing to suffer continuously and die for their beliefs. So yeah, I think while we can only establish those 3 with pretty much certainty, we can establish with pretty good certainty that they were willing to go to their deaths for their conviction that Jesus had appeared personally to them. And we have to explain that willingness. Why were they so convinced Jesus appeared to them? And I don't think a mere apparition of the dead does it, because if I'm understanding Bart on this, a grief hallucination could qualify as an apparition. And some of the apparitions I know about and that Allison speaks of in that book are corroborated. And so they can't be accounted for as grief hallucinations. Corroborated in terms of that person didn't know that that person was dead, and then the next morning they discovered that they had died, and yet they'd appeared to them just moments after their death.
Any response, Joe?
Yeah, that's the same thing with Jesus. Yeah, I mean, we agree on that. The thing is about the disciples, we don't even know really if I'm not going to go there. That would take us all night. Never mind.
All right. Question for Mike, and then we'll throw one out for both participants to respond to. Mike, is there any historical evidence independent of the Bible for the resurrection?
Well, it depends. I think we could look at something like Tacitus, who in his Annals, book 15, section 44, talks about how after Pilate had crucified Jesus, that Christianity was checked for the moment, and then it broke out again in Judea, where the evil, mischievous superstition started. I think this just shows a consistency with what we find in in the Gospels and Acts. Same thing with Josephus, in a disputed passage, but most Josephus scholars agree that Josephus mentions Jesus in that passage, that he was crucified by Pilate, and that his disciples continued to follow him. So in a strict sense, I'd say no. We have to look at the New Testament as ancient documents here and that I could look at the Quran and I don't believe it's divinely inspired, but I still can, as a historian, look at different things and conclude different things, such as there's one surah that has Jesus and God talking, and God says, did you tell them you're my son, or did you tell them that you, Mary, and me are God's? And Jesus says, no, far be it from me. You know I never said that. I've only said I'm your servant. Well, I don't believe that conversation happened, but it tells me that Muslims and Christians were having this debate on who was Jesus. Is he divine or just a man? And same thing with the New Testament. The case I've given this evening wouldn't assume at all divine inspiration. We could look at it simply as an ancient compilation of 27 different sources, ancient sources, and make our conclusions based on that.
Dr. Ehrman.
Yeah, it is a really good question. People are surprised to know how little information we have about Jesus outside of Christian sources from antiquity. You would think you'd have, birth records or accounts of the trial, or his enemies talking about him, or Roman officials saying something. In fact, nobody says anything about him during the entire first century, except for Josephus, the Jewish historian, who has 2 references to him. Within 100 years of Jesus' death, he's only mentioned 4 times in any non-Christian source. In Tacitus, the reference Mike was giving, in Pliny the Younger, 3 years earlier, and possibly in Suetonius, the Roman historian, and in Josephus. Josephus has 2 references, so there's 5 references to Jesus. These references tell us almost nothing about who Jesus was, or what he did, or what he said, and strikingly, none of them says anything about Jesus being raised from the dead.
I had something there. I agree with him on that. But I don't think it's as bad as that might lead us to believe. The Roman emperor at the time of Jesus' ministry, for him, we have just as many non-Christian sources, as many non-Christian sources who mention him within 150 years of his death as we have of Jesus. Non-Christian sources who mentions him within 150 years of his death. And Caesar Augustus, the most prominent emperor of Rome, we only have 4 primary sources that mention him, and most of these are more than 100 years after his death.
One last question, a response from both sides. I'll read it to each of you. Your response: both John and Mark are correct about the Passover meal, because the Messiah honored the Passover of Yahweh as written in Leviticus 23 on the 14th of Abib, whereas the rabbinical Jews celebrate the Passover on the 15th of Abib. Do you agree?
Yeah, Mike, do you agree? I feel like I'm in my PhD exam again. I don't know about you. Okay, so let me tell you what that meant. The problem is Mark explicitly indicates that Jesus celebrated the Passover meal. John explicitly indicates that he was crucified the day before the Passover meal. And so the question is saying that there different groups of Jews celebrated the Passover meal on 2 different days, so both Mark and John could be right. On the surface, that sounds plausible, but the reality is Jews in Jerusalem in the first century did not celebrate Passover on 2 different days. They celebrated it on 1 day, because there was only 1 day that the lambs were killed in the temple on the day of preparation for Passover.